In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. Amen. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. Another Sunday, another rich man. Seems to be the theme in the gospel these days. Last Sunday, we read about a rich man who employed a dishonest steward. And if you remember, it was more of a cautionary tale than a moral tale. And it stated that if you were dishonest in little things, then how could you be trusted with big things? Like be trusted with the furtherance of God's kingdom. This Sunday, we again have a rich man, and again have a tale more cautionary than moral. It's about what happens to those who fail to take notice of anything outside themselves or their own pleasure. It's the story of what befalls a person who fails to notice the suffering around him. At first glance, it would appear to indict the wealthy for not sharing. But we all know that one doesn't have to be rich to be guilty of the sin of not recognizing the pain and hunger present in the world. Virginia and I were talking on the phone Friday about stewardship because it's getting to be that time of year. And I asked her when she would be preaching the big stewardship sermon that everyone expects the rector to preach. Well, she laughed and said, well, if she were preaching it, it would have been this week using this week's gospel. Oh well, so here goes. And she is right. It is a message, a good message about being a good steward, especially if you think the message is about using your wealth for good so that you won't end up on the wrong side of that chasm being tortured by flames. Money or excess and lack of it have been a running theme in Luke. Luke, more than all the other gospel writers, tends to talk about economic and political and social situations. And even in the beginning of Luke, before the birth of Jesus, he writes that while Jesus was in the womb, Mary was exalting, the hungry have been filled, but the rich have been sent empty away. And then later in chapter 6, when Jesus is giving his sermon on the plain, Luke writes that Jesus speaks, "Blessed are the poor, and woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry." So many other stories followed in Luke about a lost sheep, lost coin, lost son, rich ruler, rich man with dishonest steward, storing up your treasures in heaven, and now a rich man dressed in purple linen. In today's story, the rich man has reached new lows. There was a rich man, Luke writes, who was dressed in purple and fine linen and who feasted sumptuously every day. Every day, meaning that he was not a good Jew. He believed in work on the Sabbath, or he would not have had his feast. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came to lick Lazarus' sores. The rich man indulged himself every day eating exotic and costly dishes. Now, I don't know how you picture the rich man, but I kind of have a picture in my mind of Henry VIII, dressed in fine purple royal robes, halfway reclining, eating meat every day, and specifically, I picture him holding a huge turkey leg, chowing into it with his hands, grease dripping from his beard. And as was common in the days of the rich man and Lazarus, I know he ate with his hands. And just picture it, the grease dripping from a face and the man grabbing a piece of bread with which to wipe his mouth and his hands, and then tossing it under the table for the dogs, because that was the custom of the day. And those crumbs were the crumbs of the dog. and they were also the crumbs that the beggar should have been given. It would have been common in those times to have a begging bench sitting outside the gates of a rich man's home. I read that even in the excavations of Pompeii, you could see those benches that are outside those homes. And Lazarus rightly would have expected some attention, especially from a feasting host and guests. And as we read in the story, this man feasted every day, meaning he denied Lazarus many, many, many times. And it was an unwritten code that the scraps should be given to those on the bench. Our rich man did not do it. The scene in the gospel abruptly changes and both men have died. Lazarus has been carried away to the angels with Father Abraham, and the rich man was buried and is in Hades, where he is suffering great thirst and being tormented by the flames. He looks up and sees Lazarus with Abraham, and just like the entitled man he was on earth, he sees Lazarus as a nobody who exists even in Abraham's presence only to serve his needs. What a self-centered jerk. The rich man created the unbreachable chasm when he refused to see Lazarus as anything more than part of the landscape. In his opulence, the man could look upon the pain and hunger of Lazarus, the pain and hunger of the world, without any grief or guilt touching his heart. Now, this rich man's sin was not in what he did, though, but in what he did not do. Some say that his sin was in the not noticing of Lazarus. But I say he did notice Lazarus, and that the sin was his own choosing not to act. After all, if he didn't notice Lazarus outside his house, how would he have recognized him when he was with Abraham? No, in life, the rich man thought it was perfectly natural that a divide existed between himself and Lazarus. Just like us, and the divide we create when we accept that hunger, thirst, poverty, pestilence, have and have-nots are just part of the scheme of things. After all, even in the Bible, we can pull out a text that says, the poor we will also always have with us. Of course, that was just Jesus telling Judas why it was okay for Mary to spend money on perfume for his feet. No, what the rich man did is not notice Lazarus as a human being, just placed him as part of the everyday world, and probably, like a lot of us, made judgment calls about possibly what put Lazarus among the beggars. The rich man might have thought that Lazarus needed to get a job, not a handout. And if Lazarus was sick and covered with sores, it probably was his own fault because of his own habits. Perhaps he was a drunk. The rich man also might have thought that giving Lazarus the crumbs under his table would enable Lazarus, and God forbid, make Lazarus dependent upon him forever. There were probably lots of excuses for him not noticing that Lazarus needed something. I grew up in a middle class family in a middle class neighborhood. My town was on top of a mountain outside of Chattanooga, and we had schools and shops and churches, and I never had much reason to go off the mountain. I was a sheltered child. That sheltering continued really when I went off to college. And I remember the first time I saw a homeless person, or perhaps I should say the first time I noticed a homeless person. It was on the first night of my first trip to Honduras, when some of us walked around the square that night outside of our hotel, something we did learn was not really a good thing to do. But we walked around because we had spied a Burger King in the distance, and we wanted to go get a Coke. In the shadows of all the doorways we passed, and on the benches lining the square, I saw men, women, and children sleeping out in the open. I noticed, and it certainly got to me. I teared up and thought, how tragic, how sad. But I didn't open my purse. I walked on. But you know, when you reflect on it, once you have paid attention, you can't go back. And ignoring that which you have seen after you have seen it, that's what can separate us from God's love. In our reading from Timothy today, Paul writes, the love of money is the root of evil. And he's right. But if you notice, it's the love of money that's evil, not money is evil. I mean, we all need money. Food, shelter, and clothing come with a price. So no, money is not evil. But I think all of us agree that the love of riches can separate us from God. And anything that separates us from the love of God is sin. Rich and wealthy are relative terms. The man who has 2 apples is wealthier than the man who has 1, and that man is wealthier than the man who has none. Wealth is not the issue. Right use of wealth is. If my companion and I are hungry and I have an apple and eat it all by myself without offering some to my friend, then I am guilty in the same way the rich man of today's parable is when he doesn't acknowledge the needs of the beggar. When Jesus says, feed my sheep, he doesn't ask if they deserve it, need to earn it. He just says, feed my sheep. And in Luke, with the feeding of the 5,000, his disciples have come to him and wanted him to send the crowds away so that they could go find their own food. But Jesus' answer was, you give them something to eat. So does the story in the gospel today remind us of our duty to be good stewards with all that we have, be it much or be it little? Yes, it does. Because alleviating the suffering of our neighbors is a clear calling for all who follow Jesus. Our responsibilities to one another in this life are real. And fear of Hades is not our motivation. We've progressed long and far away from a culture that sees things only from a cause and an effect. You know, that story was written before the rich man knew the love of God through Jesus himself. But for us who know the words of Christ, those of us who have promised to live by the words of Jesus, to love one another as we have been loved, the message is clear. We are charged to be grateful for what we have, to show compassion, to be good stewards who work to tend the sick, give rest to the weary, bless the dying, soothe the suffering, pity the afflicted, and shield the joyous. As we have been given all that we need, let us give freely to those who are in need. Amen.